Hi everyone, my name is Manka Ngwasu. On behalf of the Association of American Colleges and Universities and the National Center for Higher Education Management Systems, I would like to welcome you to today's webinar on policy audits. This webinar is intended for members of the Quality Collaboratives project and will introduce the idea of a policy audit and how it could be valuable as a guide to meet QC goals. As the QC project moves toward final project outcomes, you may wish to conduct policy audits as you prepare to continue your work on transfer and articulation. This webinar will provide initial first steps for setting up an audit and cover what elements might be included in a policy audit specifically geared to curricular and assessment reforms and greater assurance of quality learning outcomes for all students, including transfer students. Before we proceed with the webinar, allow me to discuss a few technical points. We currently have all participants muted to reduce background noise. If you would like to ask a question or make a comment, you can use the Q&A chat function at any time during the webinar and send questions directly to the hosts and presenters. We will post and present questions once the webinar panelists have completed their presentations. This session will be recorded and posted so that others may review it. Please let us know if you would like to ask a question off the record. I will now turn the presentation over to our panelists.
Thanks so much, Manka. This is Deborah Humphreys, and let me add my welcome to all of you. I will say that we're impressed that there are a few, I would say, the most dedicated quality collaborators out there willing to participate in the webinar on the day after the 4th of July weekend. So we very much appreciate that. We also have with us a number of terrific presenters for this session, and I'll just say a little bit to begin to get us started, and then we'll turn it over to some of our wise advisors who are going to help us clarify what a policy audit is, what the environment is in which we might be doing those policy audits, and the ways in which you might use such a device to advance your quality collaborative goals. So first let me introduce our speakers, and then I'll just say a little bit about how we're going to proceed. I will set a context, and I think most of you probably know I'm the Vice President for Policy and Public Engagement at AAC&U, and I'm on the leadership team for Quality Collaboratives, and I mostly work on the policy track of the Quality Collaboratives, along with Susan Albertine and Terry Rose. Judith Romali is also on the phone. She's a senior advisor to AAC&U and is helping to lead the policy track along with myself. We'll provide some context, but most of the content of the webinar will actually be presented by Peter Ewell and his colleague Karen Paulson. They are both from the National Center on Higher Ed Management Systems, and I think most of you already know Peter and have seen him at one or more of our Quality Collaboratives meetings, and he's a longtime advisor to AAC&U and the project. And we're very pleased to also have Karen helping us out today, and she's quite experienced with doing policy audits. And so they'll walk us through the process and can also answer questions about various ways you can come at the task of doing a policy audit. And then we're going to hear a little bit from the perspective of one of the QC policy leads, that is Ken Sauer in Indiana, to say a little bit about some policy changes that have been going on in Indiana and how they intersect with some of the issues in the Quality Collaboratives project. So we'll go to the first slide, Manka, and I'll just start us out. And if you have any technical issues in terms of seeing the slides or hearing, I would encourage you to send a note through the chat function, and we'll do our best to get you connected. I will also say before I begin the content part that we did have a number of QC participants say they were interested but were unable to attend this afternoon, but are likely to go back and take a look at and listen to the webinar that we post after the fact. So I thought we would start by just reminding everyone that the Quality Collaboratives project has involved three real interconnected strands of activity, one having to do with assessment, one having to do with policy, and one having to do with faculty leadership and development. And what I want to say is that I think for the most part, we've actually concentrated more on the assessment and the faculty leadership and development parts of this agenda, and I think that is actually appropriate given the goals and the framework that we want to put in front of people. But I do want to say that we began the project with a fairly specific and narrower policy agenda, which had very much to do with whether we could, through this project, explore ways to balance out the current focus on completion metrics with some other data and some other activities related to student learning and achievement. And we wanted to be able to do that in the context of a changing environment for policy around transfer. But we also were very aware throughout the project that you all are working on all of these issues, whether it's curriculum mapping, alignment of curriculum, new ways to assess student learning. You're doing all of that in a complicated policy environment, and one in which the policies and structures that we have are often misaligned because they were in fact built in a different era, and they were built with a different set of students in mind, perhaps a set of students that was swirling a lot less than they are in terms of their enrollment, but also in an era when there wasn't as much intentionality about either learning outcomes or their assessment. So what we're interested in doing today is to help you potentially take a look at your policies, not just those related to collection of data around assessment of student learning, but any of the other policies that might be helping or hindering your ability to meet the broader goals of the Quality Collaborative. And we're interested in that, basically in how we can contribute through this project to emerging new generations of policies, including those at both the institutional, the state, and the system levels. And so some of you are working at one or more of those levels, and we're interested in ways that we can advance wise policy that's aligned across those levels. So we put together this policy audit primarily at the advice and with the counsel of Peter Ewell, who's an expert at this. And I did want to say, before turning it over to Judith, that we do know that some of you in some states have some remaining money left in your Quality Collaborative budget. And it is possible that you may want to use some of that money to advance or hire people to help you with such a policy audit, and we would be certainly open to doing that. So before we turn it over to Peter and Karen, I want to go to the next slide and turn it over to Judith Romeli. Judith is helping with both our policy strand and our faculty engagement strand, and knows an awful lot about institutional change in a variety of policy environments. And so she's going to set a context for how the environment is changing and what its implications are for policy. Judith?
Thank you, Deborah, and hello, everybody. I've chosen to use an example from Diane Oblinger, who wrote a lovely editorial in the EDUCAUSE Review late last year, which I think captures better than anything else I've seen lately what's going on, linking it to what Deborah already said. What's starting to happen is a new kind of connected age. We've moved beyond the information age to a connection of people, resources, experiences, all kinds of content and opinions, and different communities of interest linked together in wildly changing networks all over the globe. And our QC project has unfolded as this environment has begun to take shape. That led to our appreciating that not only is it important to update our more traditional policies to reflect the people we actually serve today, how their education unfolds and what they're likely to do with their education, but also to reflect on the fact that they're learning at every moment of their day. So the emphasis in the future will be on those pathways, not on the old gatekeeping, record-keeping gateway model that we all grew up with. And so these new forms of connectivity will clearly drive changes in both policy and practice. And our hope is, by thinking about audits now You will develop a new capacity to read your own environment, both in your state and in your connections much more broadly than that. And so with that, I will turn things back over to Deborah to finish the introductory ideas.
Thank you, Judith. I also just wanted to remind everyone a core principle that we talked about at our very first Quality Collaborative meeting, and that was that we didn't want to put the cart before the horse. We wanted to be sure that any recommendations coming out of this initiative reflected this principle that what we know about good educational practice, what we know about good assessment practice, and what we share in terms of our learning goals for today's students should be the core things that drive the development of policies, rather than our starting with policies and then trying to retrofit them in some way back to the environment we are working in. And so that's a principle we began with, and one of the reasons why, frankly, we wanted to actually start more on the ground with how faculty and administrators were working together across the dyads in the project on the issue of student learning, curriculum, assessment, before we tackled any larger policy issues. One other context-setting thing, next slide, Manka, that I wanted to remind everyone about, you all are working on your own individual final project reports to us. And we are, in turn, working on 2 main publications that we expect to bring out in 2015. The first one is going to be a longer and more fulsome project report that will be focused primarily on the work of the dyads in terms of new assessment practices, new approaches to cross-institutional and systemic faculty capacity building and leadership, issues of mapping curricula, assignment design, and assessing proficiencies in the context of transfer. Go to the next slide. But we are going to do a shorter policy report. It is not written yet, and we have some ideas about it, but there's still time for you all to influence it, especially if you end up doing a policy audit and you find some interesting ideas or you have some interesting recommendations that emerge from it. There's still time to influence this report. It is tentatively titled Toward a New Quality Assurance Framework in order to reflect the first goal that I mentioned about trying to, through this project, recommend some additional data collection that systems or institutions might do to assure quality in this context. I'm going to turn it over now to Heather McCambly to talk a little bit further about this report and how we're shaping up, how it is shaping up in terms of its content. Heather, are you on the phone?
Yes, I am. Hello. So the short policy report will include recommendations, as Deborah was saying, related to collection and the reporting of data on learning outcomes, mapping outcomes of programs, participation in high-impact practices, faculty and student engagement, and assessment data focused on students' demonstrated achievement in authentic curricular-based work, which was really a large part of the mission of the Quality Collaborative project. And over time, as you've already heard, in this connected environment, we were really pulling from the grounded experiences of the Quality Collaboratives in relation to faculty development and assessment. And now we're beginning to step back and see some of the implications for policy that we want to share with policymakers in a really short, easy to digest report. And early on, we had been thinking about this report as a bit more prescriptive in terms of recommendations, but we're really focusing at this point on posing critical questions that should be addressed in policy and practice, and then providing examples of how institutions can design or revise their policies to ensure that their educational practices and the student experiences on their campuses are aligned with the learning goals they have in mind, and to advance the equitable achievement of the educational outcomes for all students, including in the context of transfer. So next slide, please, Manka. So we created this chart as we were thinking about how to briefly touch on or explain what we're thinking for the policy report. And it's really just a visual illustration of the larger question that we're asking in this report. So are the values and goals that we use in our day-to-day work to talk and make decisions about policies and practices related to learning assessment, student success, and transfer in alignment? And if not, what are the consequences and what can we do about it? So this visual is really just a snapshot of some selected components that we work with in terms of expectations and outcomes, student experiences on our campuses, and faculty and staff capacity. When we line up these individual policies or practices, which on campuses we actually did at times during the QC project, we would ideally like to find them in alignment, both vertically by theme, so for instance, expectations and outcomes, or horizontally across interconnected themes. So do expectations align with the experiences we create for students? Instead, we often find these policies and expectations are not in alignment, which poses a real challenge to our likelihood of being effective as educators or institutions. So our policy report will really try to pose productive questions that illustrate what we've learned about the consequences of misalignment through the QC project and how we might begin a shift in thought and policy making in general around outcomes and specifically some attention to transfer. And this is also the sort of analysis that a policy audit on your campus may be able to provide with greater depth and breadth in your specific context, which is why we connected it here. So next slide.
Thanks, Heather. So now I'm just going to pitch it to Peter to get us started on the nuts and bolts of a policy audit.
Okay, Karen and I are going to be doing this in tandem. I'm going to do the big picture for a couple of slides, and then Karen's going to take you step by step through the nuts and bolts of actually doing this. As Heather emphasized, and I think it's a really good segue, the specific intent of a policy audit is to see the degree to which everything is in alignment at both by level and by policy domain. NCHEMS first developed the notion of a formal policy audit about 20 years ago in projects we were doing for the Education Commission of the states about state policy, and we learned a lot about things that indirectly affect the policy in question. And the need for a policy audit, two key words on this slide are really direct and indirect, because you're going to have to pay some attention to the indirect effects of things. We, for example, discovered in New Jersey some years back when we did our first policy audits that there was a undergraduate innovation collaboration effort going on across the state university system of New Jersey, and it turned out that one of the major obstacles in all of this was policies for the motor pool in being able to sign out a car. So faculty couldn't in fact get together because they had to go through all these bureaucratic procedures in order to just physically be with one another. So pay attention to these indirect outcomes or indirect influences when you see them. Some of these are positive, some are negative, and of course some are unknown. And the idea is to block out systematically those and document their impact for action. What can you change? What is getting in your way? They operate at different levels of analysis, and don't be confined necessarily to these three: state system, campuses at the two-year colleges and the four-year colleges, but also there are curriculum or program-specific policies, particularly in professional or vocational fields in both the two-year and four-year, about what governs transfer and so on. And it's important to recognize that some policies aren't written; they're cultural or perceptual. We often would lump into in this context, for example, the perception that some credits were not going to be transferable from the two-year to the four-year in certain programs like engineering or pre-engineering. And it turned out to be not true. It was something that everybody believed, but basically wasn't the case. Monica, next slide. Just what is it? It's a systematic review connected to the areas focused on by QC, but beyond in some ways. Specific transfer policies of the two-year institutions, four-year institutions, system level, and state. The first step, as Karen will be blocking out, is to systematically identify the formal policies that are there, because this is the direct object of what we're looking for. But we also want to look at policies in support of faculty development, because there's been an awful lot of faculty development implications that have come out of the work of the dyads that have unfolded so far. Policies governing assessment or placement, institutional, system, and state policies that support needed changes in transfer policies. I mean, I think that that's a second-order thing that a policy audit has to specifically pay attention to, is not just what's in place, but once we discover some bad things about it, how are we going to change it? So what are the policies about changing these things? And then there are, just like that motor pool thing, other policies that may indirectly affect transfer and learning assessment. And I mentioned a few there: faculty workload, proficiency needed for particular programs, but anything could be in that parenthesis. You have to go quite broad. Monica, next slide. So basic principles and questions about it. I like to think of a policy audit as basically a force field analysis. What's facilitating the objective, in this case successful transfer? What is inhibiting successful transfer? And you have to document, not just identify what it is, but how specifically does it exert these things. Sketch the actual mechanism. An example might be a policy which is on the books that all credits are transferable for graduation credit, but certain programs don't accept certain credits for completing the program itself. Then there's the action step. How can we make it different if we find some things that need to be changed? How can it be modified or addressed? Who owns it? Who do we have to get to? And specifically, what will it take to get them to change what they're doing? And who are your allies? Who shares an interest in changing the policy? Whose support you might enlist? And then the question, which we rarely, but certainly should, raise in any kind of policy environment: if we change something, what are the unintended consequences? What might the effect of a desired change have on other parts of the systems in terms of funding, accreditation, marketability, public perception? Again, those three are just suggested topics to check out. There may be many, many more. And the final thing that I'll say is this may look like a lot of work, but a lot of it I think you already know. And the project team in each state and dyad really ought to sit down and say, you know, how much do we already know about this stuff, and begin to fill in the grids of this already. That's all I've got to say. I'll turn it over to Karen and Monica. Next slide.
Great. Thanks, Peter. So I'm going to go down into the nuts and bolts now. And back to Peter's comment about the need for a policy audit, you may likely have already have an idea about what's been going on with the implementation of your quality collaborative as it's rolled out, and that is more of the sort of indirect effect. If faculty took up attending the faculty development more in one unit rather than in another department, if students were more participative in some departments than in others, you might want to figure out why that was and what was getting in the way of either implementing and making it happen really well or not at all. So a policy audit will help you determine what conditions influence behavior. Behavior at the institutional as well as the individual level, it's not necessarily rational or what you would expect, which is why when Peter said some of it's perceptual or cultural, you have to keep everything kind of wide open for those possibilities as well. How you would deal with those would obviously be different than if it was a formal policy. So a lot of times you'll find out that people say everyone knows something is going on, but when you start digging, which will be a large part of your policy audit, you'll find out that there's no actual written thing that people are referring to. It's just kind of a, you know, it's in the air. So you're going to begin with this. You're going to do the initial review, as I say here, conducting the desk research. And as Peter said, you've probably already done this. You probably have a sense of policies that are affecting things, things you want to check into, questions you want to ask. We'll go deeper into each of these bullet points. Next slide, please. So as we've already mentioned, the various policies that you would look at, and this is, I'm kind of seeing this as there are two policies generally that you would be looking at for the quality collaboratives. First is as Heather was outlining in slide 7 with regard to the QC short policy report, those that are impeding or helping progress in terms of students using the new, what you built with the Quality Collaborative, and with it actually, being realized as a new, the new normal. But the other thing is the indirect, that's more the direct effect of the Quality Collaboratives and what you need to change. But there's also this indirect about why things may not have worked, and that the more first order, if implementation didn't work, why not? Because we can't even get certain things to happen before we can officially get the assessment and the transfer to work for students based on the DQP. The bottom of this slide, the italicized part, is the very important thing of unintended consequences. I mean, there can be things such as financial aid guidelines or finance guidelines, like Peter said. There could be things about not using the motor pool, no out-of-state travel, no spending. We had one institution recently that has a moratorium on any spending by units within a month of the end of the fiscal year. So if a faculty development activity was planned then, people couldn't have participated. So all sorts of things like that can come up, and it makes for good talks later about the sorts of things that could actually happen sometimes. It's sort of funny. Next slide. This, potential interviewees, you probably have thought about most of these folks. The faculty who would be participating or not participating, depending on what happened in your units on the ground. If you had a large sector of faculty that didn't participate, that you thought might do it, you might want to ask them about why they didn't. If it was just a time issue, or if it was that it's not recognized in their promotion and tenure policy, in their unit, all that sort of stuff. Same thing with academic administrators, the transfer coordinators. How much is this actually ending up affecting students? Because that's what, the success of this would be. Also, the academic advisors, what are they telling students? What's getting in the way of them telling students and helping students? The students themselves, and then curriculum coordinators. And then the final bullet point, again, the unintended folks that might have something to do with it that you might not know until someone mentions it. Next slide, please. Now, I said that they were about an hour long, and I realized that that's when it's usually Peter and me coming in. We do a lot of background research, but we don't normally know the culture and how everybody affects everything else on the campus. If you're doing this on your own campus, you probably won't need a full hour. You've used the data and the information and what you already know, and you've kind of got some working ideas about, what might be happening or which policies might be the most important to look at and consider changing. Those are the ones you're going to want to check out with the interviewees. Treat them as on-the-ground experts. You want to ask them an open inquiry. We've seen this. We know that your students do this. Based on your research, you would know that. Were there any policies in particular that have influenced this? Or it looks to me like this might be a reason why some of this is happening. Is that true, or am I all wet about that? You want to keep probing and asking. And if they say, well, you don't have anything on there about blop-de-blop, whatever it might be, some particular policy, then you want to follow up with them on, okay, well, who, as Peter said before, who's in charge of that? Where might I find data about that? What's the policy? And there's a lot of digging and digging and digging to find out where things emerge from. Next slide. These are the big level questions. As we said before, what positively influences institutional and individual behavior within an institution, and also what gets in the way of institutional and individual behavior. It might not just be the existing policies. It might be the ingrained cultural norms, as we've said. You need to probe for what the genesis of these are and how long ago something happened. You end up being, depending on the culture at a particular institution, you can often end up being almost a counselor or a marriage counselor. It could be that a well-placed policy or statement could help offset some of the the knee-jerk reactions to what had happened in the past. Questions? I guess I'll look on the screen. No questions yet. All right, next slide. That interview's for, good. You want to listen and probe for what's going on. Like I said, ask them where the policy is formally written. An example of this is that up until this past year, in New York State, the institutions couldn't get labor information, and I was asking people specifically, and sure enough, they were able to send me the link to the statute out of the Assembly that basically said that data couldn't be shared. So there's usually a very specific statute or policy or something that's been written, you know, if you're dealing with the federal government, it might be a Dear Colleague letter. The barriers, I was talking about the cultural barriers. One example we had was that we were talking to a group of faculty and a single administrator from a community college, and they were talking about the level of distrust between the faculty and the administrators. And we noted that, but you have an administrator sitting right here with you as part of your team. And they said, well, yeah, but she's okay, but this, and we're like, well, why is there so much distrust? Well, it's bad blood left over from the strike. And I was like, oh, well, you know, strikes can be quite serious. When did this happen? Now, this interview was done in the early 90s. The strike that all the distrust came from at this community college was in 1974. So this is the sort of thing, and then you have to start probing and working with the administrators on, you know, asking also the faculty, do they still act in ways that may create distrust? Does the administration, what are they doing? What are some ways that they could show more, you know, a trustworthy relationship, that sort of stuff, because that's, you want to get to what would need to be changed. Next slide, which gets to the what-if scenarios. If you've started probing and asking questions, you can start saying, you know, it looks like the motor pool policy might be in the way. What would happen if we changed that, if we just got them to relax it for the weekends? And, you know, then people will give you examples of, oh, no, that won't work because of this. Or, you know, the promotion and tenure, if we get the promotion and tenure at the departmental level to more line up with what the outcomes we want, you know, would that help? No, the college level promotion and tenure is really where the big problem is. Those sorts of things. You want to keep probing for where the level, and this is when Peter was saying that it could be at the unit level, it could be at the department level, at the college level, or even at the institutional and state system level. So, next slide. So once you've done your initial, you've got your initial information and you've done your interviews, you've got more material to kind of work through. You want to follow up and look for the policies and procedures and find out if those are really what is maybe affecting data. You may want to go back and do more interviews to double check what you're finding. You need to keep an open mind with respect to which policies, even though we've given you some examples of what policies might have an impact on the issues of the quality collaboratives, you still want to keep a pretty open mind because there could be all sorts of things that come zooming in and you have no idea that they would affect the outcome. Some cautions to keep in mind. When you're doing interviews, you need to ensure it's not just a single person with a perception or with a beef. You can do that. Oftentimes, people will be known for their particular issue. I'm sure you know people like that. And if you double check with other interviewees, they'll say, oh, that's just KP's issue, or that's just, you know, Peter's issue, without you saying it was Peter's issue. So you can find out, you know, that and then probe for why they might feel that, you know, if that doesn't affect other people, why doesn't it affect other people? I think that's it for that. Next slide. So then you're going to summarize and write up your findings, and here's the potential follow-up. Even though this is written solely about policies, it could be as simple as having, you know, especially if it's a cultural or a behavioral change, an encouraging statement from someone in the right position, a dean, a department chair, a student leader or something, in order to get people to change their behaviors. But if it's an actual policy, then you might want to suggest a new policy, ways to adapt whatever is existing in the policy or procedure. This undo outdated formal statutes or policies. When I said about the New York General Assembly and the law that they have on the books about not sharing data, that is something that will need to be undone formally because it was voted on and everything by the Assembly. So sometimes you have things like that at the Faculty Senate level or at the system level that were a Board of Regents or Board of Trustees thing that they voted on. Then delete any unneeded policies, like for instance, maybe the motor pool policy doesn't make sense anymore in this day and age. And pursuant to what Judith was saying, that things that were limited, you know, online education has changed a lot. Instead of everything being from 8 to 5, we now have to have things available 24/7. And a student is more participating in their own education, so they may want to be able to see where they are in the DQP at any particular time. So it can't just be available from 8 to 5. It needs to be a 24/7 when the student needs it, when the faculty member needs it, when the academic advisor needs it. And you want to expose these myths about policy and reinforce what the reality is. Because if people have come up with the idea of, well, it's like this because it's always been like that, then you need to highlight that the policy doesn't say what people think it says, and that's when an encouraging statement from a high-placed person might be very useful. Next slide. The scope of a policy audit, you've heard me talk and Peter talk about all the various levels. It depends on your needs. You know which level you're working at, and you just need to be open to that. It may be that if you're looking just at your department, that there may be college level or institutional level or system level things that your department can't change, but that you have to work with others higher up to try and alter. But you can definitely start just at the department level. It can be conducted by people either internal to the project or external, or you can, you know, from across units on campus if you want to share with another department and have them come in and look and see, and you do the same with their department. Or you could contract it out externally to groups such as NCHEMS or others. External people can be a useful reality check, and they can also give you ideas about how it's done at other places. So it might even be if you had a physics department, you would want to share with a different physics department, maybe in the same system or something. And this can be done with very modest resources, or if you wanted a more full-scale policy audit, then you would bring in more people, external reviewers, as well as maybe an external group. So the point for this is that you want to go for triangulating what you're finding. You want to go beyond what a single person has said and find out if it really is influencing large-scale behavior and change. That's all I have on the nuts and bolts of a policy audit, and I'll turn it over to Ken now.
Okay, and greetings from the Hoosier State. I'd like to spend a little time talking about how, in Indiana at least, the Quality Collaboratives project coincided very nicely with some changes that were taking place within our state. So there was a real dialogue that took place between the individuals who were involved with the QC project and the rest of the system, and indeed the state as a whole. So the first bullet emphasizes that the Commission for Higher Education, which is a coordinating board here in Indiana, partnered with the legislators on a transfer core curriculum. As is often the case, the Commission works closely with the institutions and with the legislature whenever the General Assembly is in session. And depending upon who introduces a topic, sometimes it's a legislator who has an idea, sometimes it's the commission that wants to introduce legislation, so we craft some language and work with a legislator. But irrespective of how the topic is introduced, we really do try to work closely together with the institutions and with legislators to get a good end result. In 2012, legislation was introduced to establish a statewide transfer general education core of at least 30 semester hours. When the project unfolded, the team that led this particular project landed on 30 hours. This was in part to allow for additional general education requirements to be at the institution's discretion later on in the curriculum, particularly with the upper division coursework. And I might add, while this legislation clearly focused on transfer, the legislation really was an occasion for all institutions and our higher education as a system to focus on what students needed to know and how they might use that knowledge. What kind of general education foundation do we want all of our students to have, irrespective of whether they transfer or not? The legislation indicated that the statewide transfer core had to be based on competencies and learning outcomes. It said nothing about courses. And indeed, as this year unfolded, the legislation actually called for the Gen Ed core to be developed and implemented within a single year. But as this legislation, as the implementation of the legislation unfolded, we banished any talk of courses at the beginning. We wanted this to be focused entirely on competencies and learning outcomes. The third bullet indicates that the legislation delegated to faculty teams the task of actually defining the outcomes and competencies. In fact, the legislation said that the institutions would develop the Gen Ed core, these competencies and learning outcomes, in collaboration with the Commission. So the Commission clearly understood that this is something that ultimately the institutions have to develop, although if it's going to work as a system, that is to say, if somebody who completes this core would be able to transfer to any other public institution within the system, the Commission had to make sure that this was really functioning the way it was supposed to. And after there was a consensus around the competencies and learning outcomes that would constitute this general education core, each institution then went back and put together its own array of courses that would lead a student to master these competencies and learning outcomes. And finally, the last bullet emphasizes that the legislation, as well as the QC initiative, which again unfolded in parallel, really was an occasion to look at some new approaches for assessment and assessment design. I might say the legislation didn't talk about assessment, but as the faculty teams came together and as the academic leaders participated in this event, in this implementation of the legislation, there was very quickly a consensus reached that although the legislation didn't talk about assessment, we had to. And in our state, at least, we're looking to the multi-state collaborative to advance learning outcomes assessment with its emphasis on student work, authentic learning outcomes, as the primary means by which we would look to an assessment mechanism for the statewide transfer Gen Ed core. And assignment design comes into play as well, and that's one of the reasons why, as part of this effort, we put together a statewide workshop on signature assignments. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to, I'm not sure who goes next. Is it Deborah?
It would be me, Ken. Thank you. we wanted to just have Ken walk us through that as just one example of a context in a state where the issues on the ground came very directly in conversation with specific policy initiatives at the state level. And I'm sure that it's still playing out how those things are going to ultimately be implemented and refined over time. Before we turn to Q&A, I wanted to just make a final plea that if in fact you do decide to do some policy audit or just looking at what's happening in your state or institution, we are still looking for examples from the QCs of very specific examples of any recommendations you might want to make about new sources of data that we want to feed into any kind of accountability discussions at the state level that would capture the issue of the quality of learning as well as the completion data, and or any specific policy change stories that you want to share. You can feed all of that to myself or to anyone on the leadership team at the QC, and we'll work with it in our drafting of the final policy report, and all the QC participants will have a chance to look at that and provide us feedback on it before it gets published. So we'll turn it over to Malka to moderate, or I guess actually Becky might be moderating our Q&A. I think we have a number of people in this session, and I'm not sure whether we open it up for people to talk or whether you want them to feed it in.
Either. If you would use the chat function or the Q&A function on the right-hand part of your screen, you can go ahead and type in any questions or comments that you might have for the panelists, and we will post those and present those as they come in. And if you would prefer, if you have a question that might make more sense verbally, please use the hand raise function or the chat feature to let us know that you would like us to unmute you, and we can do that as well.
And I guess this is Deborah. While we're waiting for people to put in some questions, I actually have one that I'd like to pose to you, Ken. I've always sort of admired very much the process that you all described and went through of sort of figuring out who should do what in terms of the legislature putting in place something designed to facilitate a more common understanding and an ability to facilitate more effective transfer, but then delegating down to other people to do different things. And I wonder if you could just say a word or two about sort of balancing the need to have commonality in order to make the transfer process work, while also respecting the identities of departments and programs and institutions to craft their own general education programs. How has that played out, Ken?
Well, I think it's played out pretty well, and this has been now 2 years that we've been at the statewide transfer Gen Ed core, and I should say we're also, there's another bill that was passed in the 2013 General Assembly which called for single articulation pathways, looking at the next 30 hours in an associate degree, so that the associate degree in its entirety would be based on competencies and learning outcomes, and that would transfer to all related baccalaureate degrees at public institutions within the state. I think this is where I think the language in the legislation, which called for the institutions in collaboration with the Commission for Higher Education to develop this statewide transfer Gen Ed core, really was so critical because it really allowed the Commission as a state agency to make sure that the process was actually being implemented. It allowed the Commission to gather people, to raise questions, to have resources brought to bear on the process, to ensure that this was functional, to ensure that this was something that would not only work from an academic standpoint, but also from the standpoint of academic services, from the registrars and so forth. So I think while we brought the Commission's perspective into this, as well as those of Vice Chancellors for Academic Affairs and Deans, the actual selection and identification of the competencies and learning outcomes came from the faculty. There were faculty panels that were put together for each one of the 6 competency areas, and it was the faculty who really led the discussions about what competencies and learning outcomes they wanted to see in our statewide transfer gen ed core. And then finally, once there was consensus on those competencies and learning outcomes, it was up to each institution to go back and put together the courses that they felt were appropriate for a student to take in order to master those competencies and learning outcomes.
Okay, great. Thanks, Ken. That gave us some more context. We definitely have a few questions.
Yeah, and I'll just list off the first one, and that is, I was wondering what the rough cost would be to get an external investigator for the audit.
Peter or Karen, can you give us a range of what someone might expect on that?
You want to try that on Karen, because you've done them more recently than I have. But it depends a lot. I mean, I think we'd have to talk to you directly as to whether you wanted folks, I mean, if you were dealing with NCHEMS, whether you wanted actual on-site interviews, or whether we would write up, would do part of the desk audit work and then suggest kind of questions to ask, and then you ask them. It really depends. It's not terribly expensive, but it does involve, you know, about $5,000 or higher.
Yeah, I was going to say, you know, a basic one at an institutional level would be $5,000 to $10,000. That would be what Peter said.
And that would entail a written report at the end of it and things like that. But while we've got the floor, and that being the only question that's written now, I wanted to stress something that Ken said. One of the things that we should, when we fix this seminar, again address directly is whether or not a policy is actually being implemented. A lot of policies are out there, but they just sit there because the state agency or the person responsible for the policy just doesn't have the troops to enforce it, or it's just roundly ignored and there are no consequences. So don't forget those things that really are there, but they don't seem to really be in place.
Right. We have 2 more questions.
We do, and so the next one can come actually from my colleague Susan Albertine, so I'll turn it over to her.
Yeah, Susan Albertine here, and this is a Peter and Karen question. It's also related to something that somebody wrote on the chat. Do you have any tips for people about how to ask the right questions? What is the problem that needs fixing? You know, how do you focus on the right questions to do your sleuthing? What's the story that you want to tell? It's tough because it's just a wilderness of policy out there, and you could spend your whole, you know, career hacking away at it. But there's some really, really important things that might get in the way of student learning through transfer. And I just wondered if you had any pointers for getting to the really incisive questions about policy.
I'll give that a first crack by talking about something that, again, we didn't mention. And I'll warn everybody, our office is near a train line, and it is coming by, and it will whistle. So that's not your imagination.
Okay.
But in any case, one thing that we did in the ECS, the Education Commission of the States projects that we first developed this technique with, is to find somebody very concrete who's trying to make a change, and then to say basically what specifically is getting in your way. What's the manifestation of the roadblock? That makes it, Susan, a lot more concrete than just in the welter of policies. Now you've got something to look for as what is it that is out there like that. Terry's question is interesting in that respect as well, because he says, says, he asked, are there any institutions that do this on a regular basis, institutions or states? Actually, I don't know of any that do it on a regular basis. It tends to be in relation to policies which are being proposed at the moment, the second part of Terry's question, and that's when it comes forward, is what are we going to run into if we propose to do something new?
And I would say that that's when things were happening really rationally, that doesn't necessarily always happen. Indiana clearly did that and thought about all the ramifications before they sort of went into it. But sometimes you'll find, especially at some of the state and system levels, that they don't think about all the ramifications. And I know it's bad that I said that, but I'm sorry. It happens.
All right. Are there any final questions from the field? All right. Well, we thank you very much for participating, and we're certainly available to answer questions that might occur to you later. And as Monica said at the beginning, we have recorded the call and the presentations, and we'll be posting both the slides and the recorded webinar. So if you want to share either the whole thing or just the slides with your colleagues, we would be happy for you to do that, and we'd be happy to field questions after the fact. Any final comments from my colleagues? Judith, you want to have a final word?
Only that I've enjoyed this because I'm teaching a class in the fall on policy. So thank you for the reminders.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you all very much, and I want to thank Monica and Becky and my other colleagues for helping us out. Thank you so much, Karen and Peter.
Okay.
Have a great day.
Thanks very much. Bye now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.